Thank you, Jim. My name is Joe Hudson, and I'm an alcoholic. And I want to get that out of the way first. I spoke over in Winston-Salem at the midwinter, and halfway through my talk, my wife had to get up and call time out and tell them I was an alcoholic. I have never got used to getting up here and talking before people. I get nervous and never know how this is going to come out. I've heard about Blackstone since I've been in Alcoholics Anonymous. I never thought that I would ever be part of a program at Blackstone. And I want to thank the committee and the trustees for asking me to be a part of this program. I think it's just fantastic. Now, there's one thing about it. I don't think you'll ever have any wet drunks to get into any of your meetings here, because it's taken me about 3 days to find out how to get here without making a boo-boo. I like that tape. I live in Arkansas, on the Arkansas side of Texarkana, and most of my meetings are in Texas. And in Texas, if you don't give your sobriety date, they don't let you talk. Because they say if you don't have one, if you don't have a sobriety date, you might, or give one, you might not have one. So my sobriety date is January 12th, 1969. Yes, Irene. Where's Irene? I am in that class, too, of 1969. Now, in January 12th, 1969, I wasn't an alcoholic. It took me 2 days to become an alcoholic. But I knew about as much about staying sober as that oil man did that lived down in Fort Worth. And he retired at 55 years old. And he come up into Arkansas to do some ranching. And he bought him 3 acres. And he bought him 2 cows. And he was going to raise cattle. And after about 3 years, he didn't have no calves. And he went out and he talked to the farm agent one day, and he said, "What am I going to do?" He said, "I've got 2 fat cows. I've been feeding them for 3 years, and all they're just fat and no calves." He said, "You've got to have a bull." And the next day, that old man loaded up his 2 cows and took them into town and traded them for a bull. So I knew about as much about staying sober as that old man did about raising cows. Now, I'm not going to get up here and try to tell you that I'm an expert on alcoholism. I'm not even an expert on Joe. And it reminds me of the story of this man that was an expert on raising chickens. And he went around all over the country giving these lectures. And he had a group of chicken raisers into a group one afternoon, and he's talking to them, and he said, the way to get the best results out of your chickens is that you separate them when they're 1 day old, the males from the females. And naturally a hand went up and said, "How do you tell a male from a female when they're 1 day old?" I said, "Well, you go get you a bucket of worms. And you feed the worms." Said the male chickens will eat the male worms, and the female chickens will eat the female worms. And, of course, another hand went up and said, "How do you tell a male worm from a female worm?" He said, "Hell, lady, I don't know. I'm a chicken expert, not a worm." So that's about as much of an expert as I am about what I'm going to talk about tonight. But I am going to talk about me, and I'm going to talk a little about you, and I'm going to talk about God, and I'm going to talk about the things that brought me to Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm going to talk about fear of the unknown. I'm going to talk about some guilt, and I'm going to talk about remorse. Now, I had all of these things before I ever started to drink alcohol. I did not start to actively drink alcohol till I was 30 years old. It took me 18 years before I had to get down on my knees and surrender to a God of my understanding. But during that 18 years, some of it was happy and some of it was rough and some of it was tough. And it was a rough road getting here. And I paid my dues. To be a member of the downtown group of Alcoholics Anonymous in Texarkana. And by the way, before I forget it, I want to introduce my wife, which has a hell of a lot to do with me being sober tonight. Well, Norma, would you stand up, please? I'm going to talk about her a little bit later. That woman almost killed me. I had my first drink at about the time that most people that are in our program is around 14 years old. And I didn't like it. No, I didn't like it at all. I was born and raised in western North Carolina, up there out of Forest City, out in the country. And we knew the bootleggers, and we knew the drunkards. That's what we called them in those days. We knew who the drunkards were, and we knew who the bootleggers. And there was two other boys and myself one Sunday afternoon. We was out hunting some muscadines, and we saw the bootlegger pull up and stop his car, and he run up and stuck something in a stump hole. And he jumped in the car, and he left, and we went up, and we uncovered it. It was a quart of the whitest-looking stuff you've ever seen. And we took the cap off, and we knew what it was. And we started daring each other to take a drink. And I don't think any of us ever really got a drink down. Man, I put some of that down, and man, that burned down here, and it come back up through my eyes and my nose, and I sputtered and spit. And we wasted quite a little bit. And we knew we had to do something, and there wasn't no creek around, but we filled it up, and we put it back in that stump hole. And it wasn't as clear when we put it back as it was when we took it out. And then we waited to see who come to get it. I'm sure that bootlegger and that drunkard had a few words to say later on down the line. But that was quite an experience, and I didn't drink alcohol. 45 years ago, at this time of the year, I was stationed out here at Fort Pickett, or at that time they called it Camp Pickett, and I didn't drink alcohol. Because when we talk about, in western North Carolina, when we talk about the church, and I don't know about your place, but, you know, if you was a member of the Presbyterian Church, they said you were a member of the Presbyterian Church. But if you're a member of the Methodist Church, they said the Methodist Church, or the Catholic Church. But when they mentioned the church, they're talking about the Southern Baptist Church. And that's what I was in. That's what I was in. But first I'm going to talk about, that's where my first guilt started. But my first fear was fears of rejection. When I was 9 years old, I had a severe case of whooping cough. Severe case. And so did my sister. And it come in the fall, and it just kept coughing and whooping, and the doctor had been out to see us a couple of times, and he diagnosed me to have tuberculosis. And in 1929, man, that's a closet case. That's a closet case. I have been associated with two illnesses that are closet cases. So I was put into a room and was isolated from the rest of the family, and they would bring me my food in there and take it out, and they'd scald it, and I couldn't get outside, and they wouldn't let any air come in under the doors. They'd even have rugs down to keep them out, and there was a fireplace in that bedroom, and I stayed in there from sometime around October, because I know that it was right after the close of the stock market and the fall of the banks, because my father was a barber, but he also was a farmer, and he would buy his seed and his fertilizer in the spring of the year and sell his crops in the fall of the year, and he'd pay for this, and maybe he'd make a little money, and maybe not. But I know that he had sold his crop, and he hadn't paid his bills, and the banks closed, and he had a dime in his pocket, and that's what I heard him tell this doctor. And the doctor told him, he said, well, I know that you will pay me. But he said, I'm going to have to see him about once or twice a week. And he did. He'd come out to see me, and really nothing was happening except I was just getting weaker and weaker. And come about February, and it kind of got warm. And I told my father one night, I said, I'm going to die if I stay in this room. I said, I'm going to die. I was getting so weak then I could hardly walk up and sit down in front of the fireplace. And he said, tomorrow you can get out in the sunshine. And I got out the next day, and then I got out some more the next day. And this doctor told me that I could never be a normal person. I could never participate in sports. I could never do any of these things that most people did because of my tuberculosis. Well, I guess I had right then some things that makes you an alcoholic. In fact, I could identify with John last night that he was the only person in his family that was an alcoholic. I'm the only person in either side of my families that are alcoholic. Now, there might be a reason for that. I don't know. If they had a drink, they might have been alcoholic too. But anyway, I'm the only one. So I did not come from an alcoholic family. And if there's ever been a Christian woman, I know that my mother was a Christian woman. Because she found in her church at an early age what it took me 48 years to find in a lonely bedroom in Las Vegas, Nevada. But anyway, I finally got out of that bedroom, and I got out, and we dismissed that doctor, and I started getting better. But even living in the country, we didn't have close neighbors. But as I'd get out and I'd walk, and I'd pass some of these houses, and the kids would be out in the yard, and you'd hear the mothers or the fathers say, call their children in. Don't play with him, he's got tuberculosis. And I tried to make you think that didn't bother me. I tried to make you think that. I could give you the outer appearance that it wasn't bothering me, but it was eating me up inside. I went back to school the next year. I'd missed a year in school. And the kids would come up to me and say, my mom or my daddy told me not to play with you, not to have anything to do with you because you got TB. And I'd try to make them think that it didn't bother me. But it did bother me. It did. It was tearing me up down here. See, my life is pretty much like a cabbage. And I like to compare my insides to a cabbage head. You know, right now you've got cabbage plants out there, and they're floating in the breeze, those leaves are, and they're happy. But as these cabbage heads continue to grow, they form a little core. And then they form a leaf, and that leaf starts to tighten up and to tighten up and to tighten up. And then a few months you'll go out there, and that's a nice, firm cabbage head. Well, that's the way my life was. That I was happy in here, like that cabbage leaf. But as these resentments come, and as these layers of guilt come, and these layers of fear of the unknown come, those layers started to build up, and it made a core down here in my gut. I might be the only one that had that core, but I believe Irene talked about it this morning. And that core is what almost choked me to death. And it's taken Alcoholics Anonymous. And I've been working on this for 19 years, and I still have some more to clean off. I've had to clean these resentments, these layers off that I'd buried so deep that I was unaware of it. And I've had to take them off one at a time, just like they were put on. But anyway, that was the first fears, and it was fears of rejection that appeared in my life. And then when you become and you've been attending a Southern Baptist church, and by the time you're 12, 13, 14 years old, man, they expect you to join that church. They really expect that. Now, up there in our part of the country in those days, we would have school in the summertime, and then they'd let us out in the fall. We'd go to school for, I don't know, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that, till the crops was ready to be harvested, and then we would be let out of school, and then we would harvest the crops and then go back to school. And it was during the time that we'd be going to school is when we had that revival. We had a 2-week revival every year. And the school wasn't too far from the church. And every morning, I tell you what, now, they didn't have these courts and all to tell them what they could do. You know, they marched you down to the church. And they'd have a morning meeting, and then you went from home at night. You'd go to 2 meetings a day for 2 weeks. And man, that one year, I think every do-gooder in that church prayed over me. Man, every session, there's somebody wanting me to give my heart to God. And nothing was happening in here. And I didn't do anything that summer. And I was about 13, I guess. But I done made up my mind when the next revival come along, I was going to join that church the first meeting and get them off my back. And that's exactly what I done. Whenever I saw that tall man get out of that choir, I knew he was coming to me. And he come and he put his arms around me and wanted to know if I'd give my heart to God. I said, yes, I will. Let's go. And I went up and I joined the church and I was baptized. And that is where the first guilt started to build in me. There was nothing happened in here. Not a thing. I was just a member of the church. And there was nothing that had gone on to change my life, except I started to build in guilt. Well, I went on through the war, and a lot of things built up, and I come back, and my first wife had a health problem. She was an asthmatic, and we moved to Phoenix, Arizona for her health. And it did help her, and she lived, I'm quite sure, several years longer than she would have lived had we tried to stay back in this part of the country. But I went to work for a company, a grocery company in Phoenix. It was one of the larger companies there, and I went up real fast. I was at the right place at the right time, and I went up real fast in this company. And at 29 years old, they had made me an officer in this company. And I did not drink alcohol. But when I got to be in the position of purchasing and merchandising and doing all of these things, and I started being entertained with alcohol. And it didn't make any difference in those days whether I drank the next day or not. I started entertaining with alcohol. And now that I know and taking my inventory that I went through different phases of alcoholism, and I could see myself going down, 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 but it was taking quite a few years for this to happen. I know that it got to the point that somebody was taking me to lunch about every day, and I had 4 restaurants in the Phoenix area. Well, they had an epidemic of alcoholism going around out there about that time. And that's where I caught it. I know now I caught it in one of those 4 restaurants. Somebody didn't wash those glasses good, and I caught alcoholism. Because whenever I'd go into these 4 restaurants, they knew that they were to bring me vodka instead of water in that glass. They knew if they brought me coffee, that it was a coffee royal. And we'd leave, and these people that see, we had a policy in our company. You didn't drink on the job. And I thought that was a good policy, and it was a good policy. And these people that I'd be drinking with, be eating with, they'd have 2 or 3 martinis, and hell, they'd get up and they'd be fine. Hell, I'd be drunk. And they couldn't understand it. And sometimes I'd go back to work, and sometimes I wouldn't. And this kept going on to the point that I knew that this was going to catch up with me, and that I had better move on. And in the meantime, well, our company had gone on the stock market, and I had become the third largest stockholder in that company. But I resigned. I resigned that job and went to Las Vegas. My wife had died in the meantime, and then I had met Norma, and Norma was a good drinker like me, and except she could drink me under the table, and I couldn't understand that. But she didn't care whether she had a drink the next day or not, and I had to have one. But, see, there's something happened. I started building an organization from one person and built it up to 350 person, and it was we. And it was you, and I recognized you. But then it got to the point that it was the big I and the little you. And to give you an example of what happened, as this company that I was building there in Phoenix, it got so big, we was exchanging Christmas gifts. And then I said, I'll tell you what we'll do. I said, whatever money you people will spend to buy me a Christmas gift, I'll match it, and we'll buy baskets for the needy. And they thought that was a good idea. And we done that. And the first year or two, we only had 5 or 6 baskets, but we'd find out the children sizes and take them toys and clothes and food. And I'd deliver some of these baskets. And nobody was taking any credit for this. We were giving of ourselves and trying to help somebody. Now, the last year that went on, we put out 178 baskets that year, and I thought they ought to put my name on the front page of the paper. It had become the big I and the little you. And that's what alcohol will do to you when you become an alcoholic. That's what it'll do to you. And that was killing me, and I did not know it. But then I resigned, and I went to Las Vegas. Now that's the place you go. If you're an alcoholic, you're a budding alcoholic, man, you can go up there and you can drink around the clock 7 days a week. And nobody really pays a hell of a lot of attention to you. So that's good. I went up there, I went in business for myself. I bought me a Ben Franklin store and a Western Auto store. The worst mistake I ever made. 2 good stores, but I wasn't capable of running them. Hell, I wasn't capable of running those stores down there. Hell, they was going to fire me from a company that I was one of the largest stockholders in. They was going to fire me, and I knew it. You can't go to meetings chewing parsley and it running down out of your mouth and all that stuff without somebody noticing you. Trying to keep... Every time somebody tell me about something that would keep from smelling whiskey on your breath, hell, I'd try it. And I guess that parsley was the worst thing. They showed me some pictures later on. Man, I went to some of those meetings, I looked bad. But as we got into up to Las Vegas, and Norma could see what was happening to me, and she went out to try to get some help for me. And she talked to some people, and I'm building this cabbage head, just keeping on building on and laying in, and I don't know, I've got all these resentments that I've buried. And she found a place or a fellowship, and it was called Al-Anon. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Al-Anon, and I never talk that I don't mention this. If it had not have been for Al-Anon, this boy would probably have never got sober. I think it has one of the greatest impacts on me. If my wife had not have gone to Al-Anon, I know I never would have lived till I got here. Now, some of you your husbands might have abused you, but my wife abused me, and abused me bad. Now, she said she never did shoot at me to hit me. But I know damn well out there in the desert between Wickenburg and Las Vegas, I passed that bullet 3 times. She cut me with a knife. She cut me with a bottle. I mean, she was rough on me. And I stayed so sore all the time. I had blue places on me and so damn sore, I knew, excuse me, I knew I had cancer. And you'd get these places and you'd rub them till you'd make damn sure you had, and I'd cough till I knew I had tuberculosis. But I know that these blue places I just couldn't understand. And some places where they would be, I'd be blue. I just couldn't understand it. I'd go try to figure out if the furniture, if I ever hit the furniture. And I couldn't find any place. But she went to Al-Anon, and I started getting better. The last year that I drank, I probably was in better shape body-wise. I didn't have no bruises, and I didn't hurt. And I was in AA for quite a while before I realized what the hell she was doing. When I'd pass out, if she didn't have on those sharp-pointed shoes, she'd go put them on. And then she didn't even pick her places to kick me. Wherever she hit, that was fine. But it did, I do want to thank the program of Al-Anon for saving my life and getting me here. I got a little bit ahead of my story. I wanted to tell you about the tuberculosis and finish that story. And since I had been rejected on several things because I had had TB, and I knew when World War II come along that I was going to get a call. When you're 21 years old and they start drafting people, I knew I was going to get that call. A lot of my friends went down within a few days after Pearl Harbor, and they enlisted, and they got into whatever they wanted in. And I knew the day was going to come, and I knew that the day would come, and I'd get those greetings. And I dreaded it, because I knew I'd be rejected again. I knew I'd be rejected. And sure enough, in July of 1942, I got the call, and I went to our local hospital, and if you was warm there, well, they sent you on to Fort Jackson. Now, it's quite a ways to Fort Jackson from the Rutherford County Courthouse. There's 50 of us was put on a bus. 2 of them was crippled. And I knew that there'd be 3 of us that would be rejected, those 2 cripples and me. And I didn't want that bus to get there, that I would have to go through the rejection again. And we got there, and we went through the examination. And whenever we was finished, I had to go talk to a guy with 2 silver bars on his shoulder, and he asked me a lot of questions, and then he asked me if I'd ever had tuberculosis, and I told him yes. He asked me when, I told him when, asked me several questions, and that was the end of it. Well, that night, whenever they called the roll to get back on the bus, everybody was called but me. The 2 cripples had been rejected, but everybody else had the dates to come back and report. The next day, they put me through exactly the same thing that they had the day before. And whenever I got to the end of the line that day, there was a guy with a little silver eagle up here. And of course, I thought he wasn't as high up in the rank as that guy was with them 2 bars the day before. I didn't know anything about rank. And he asked me the same questions, and I answered them the same way. He said, "You have never had tuberculosis." He said, "Yesterday we thought we might have had the wrong set of lungs. But," he said, "today we've had them hands hairy." He said, "You've never had pneumonia." I said, "No, sir. To my knowledge, I haven't." He said, "You've really never had a deep, deep cold, because there's not a blemish on your lungs." And he said, if I hadn't have known some doctors during that time that was working through children right after the fall of the stock market, he said, we would have thought you was lying. But he said, we're going to give you a date to report back. And he gave me the same date that he had given my friends that went down the day before. And I got on a bus to ride back to the Rutherford County Courthouse by myself. By this time, this doctor had become the wealthiest man in our county. I have never had this kind of thoughts about a person in my life. And I knew I could not go back and tell anybody because they would not believe me. So I buried all of these resentments. And I didn't know they were resentments then. I found that out after I got in AA. At that time, they were grudges. And I buried those grudges down here in my gut. And it helped build that core that almost choked me to death. And whenever I went back and was not rejected, it was a great relief. But I had those resentments, and I had made up my mind when I come out of service, I was going to be a richer man than that man. And it didn't make any difference how I'd done it. And these were the thoughts that I had. Well, now that I've got ahead of myself on that, but now that I'm going to talk a few things about the last things that I happened. And of course, the Al-Anon was one of the last things that happened within the last year of my drinking. And then along about that time, Norma was going to get me sober. And we're going to go up into the mountains, Mount Charleston, and we're going to camp and picnic for these weekends. And I thought it was a fine idea. And I didn't know what to expect. So the first trip we went up, well, I let all of the air out of the spare tire. And I wrapped me up about 12 half pints of vodka, and I put them in that spare tire so I could have a drink. And I let her check me as we went up there, and she could tell I didn't have on, there wasn't nothing there. But I got drunk, and she couldn't understand it. She said, well, why don't we come back up here every weekend? I said, I think it'd be a fine idea. So the next week I went up there, and I buried me 12 half pints all around that place. Because I knew I couldn't find them all, but I'd find part of them. But during that summer, there's one of those canyons about halfway down that they had some overhanging rocks, and it was where the animals would come down and make a little trail, and they'd get under there and get out of the weather. And this come into play with me a little later on that year. But I didn't get sober. But we did go up there, and we did stay out in the open. And then one morning I got up to go to work, and Norma had been going to Al-Anon, and if I was drinking, she wouldn't help me at the store. Now, if I went down there without drinking, now she'd come help me. So that morning I got up and I didn't take a drink. And I went out to get in the car, and it looked daisy inside, hazy as it could be. And I opened the door, and there was some smoke coming out of the seat. And I said, one of them dang high school kids come by here this morning and throwed a lit cigarette in here. And I went and got me a little saucepan and come back to put it out. And heck, that wouldn't have worked. So I ended up getting a garden hose and tearing out the whole front seat. It'd been smoldering all night long. And I thought I had it all out, and went in and got me a towel, and Norma went on to open up the store, and I put a towel over those springs, and I started to work. The floorboard's full of water, slashing around. And boy, I get about 2 blocks, and man, it got hot. Ooh, it was burning me up. It was about to brand me. So I pulled into a service station and asked them where the closest fire station was. And man, those people talked about my mother and me and told me to get that thing away from their gas pumps. But they told me where a fire station was. Now, when an alcoholic starts to think, you're in trouble. And as I started out and I hit a school zone, and I had a thought that if I don't want it to blaze, I won't give it any air. And I rolled up those windows as tight as I could get them, and I headed to the fire station. And time I got there, well, I just opened the door and rolled out. And I got up and staggered in, and I told the one of the firemen, I said, I brought you a fire. And he didn't even pay attention to me. He didn't pay no attention to me at all. There was another one come by. I said, I brought you a fire. And he didn't pay no attention to me. So the captain come by and I said, I brought you a fire. He said, where is it? I said, out in the driveway. And he went out in the driveway and he come running back there and said, damn sure did. And he got all of those firemen and they went out there and they finished tearing out the rest of that front seat of that car and told me that I should have somebody come pick me up and take me home. And I told them I could drive, so they got a bunch of cardboard and they put me in that car. And I was going to go to work, but I had to go back by where we lived, and I couldn't go. I was getting so weak up here in the head. And I stopped, and the lady that come in and helped us out one day a week at the house was there that day, and she took me to the hospital about 12:30, and they kept me about 3 hours in the emergency room and told me that another 15 minutes in that car and I'd have been dead. But I would be all right about midnight, by midnight. And I was. Now, what do you think happened? I went out and got me some more to drink, and I got drunk. I got drunk. Even though I'd almost lost my life, but I got drunk. And at that time, well, I was a member of the Satoma Club. Satoma was pretty strong in the West, and it service to mankind. And it met at noon. Now, I was a member of that. Now, the only thing that I had in mind that was good for a half pint going, a half pint coming back, and 2 drinks during the meeting. As far as mankind was concerned, hell no, I wasn't doing nothing. Well, I was at the point that I don't want nobody talking about my drinking. Any of you ever been there? You don't want nobody talking about your drinking. And they had a program, and I knew they had it for me. Can you imagine a service club having an alcoholic and an Al-Anon come to talk and bring the program? That's what they had that day. And they were there to tell us about the facilities that they had in Las Vegas for the men and for the women. And then they showed a little picture. They showed a little picture of what happens to you if you be alcoholic. That you take this alcohol in, it goes directly to the blood system, and that sets up the obsession, and these little white monkeys start going to the brain. And that 1 is too many and 1,000's not enough. And man, I left there that day, and I thought, I'm going to resign. And I did. I went back, and I resigned from that Satoma Club. Told them my business would not permit me to come back to any more meetings. But let me tell you something. Never got drunk one time after that. I didn't see the little white monkeys going to my brain. It was a pretty powerful 12-step call. A powerful 12-step call. And I was having an awful lot of trouble with my car. Man, my drunk car was a bad-looking thing. I never did wreck that car, but I was a fender bender. And whenever I come to Alcoholics Anonymous, them 2 front fenders, just like a buzzard, just flapping. And I never did know what happened, how I got them on there. But it was wearing me. And I knew that someday that somebody was going to come and lay some papers on me for something that I didn't know I'd done. I knew that. I knew that was going to happen, and I couldn't do anything about it. So, I know that there had been a little talking going on, I'm sure, between my wife and some members of AA. But one afternoon, have you ever been to the point that I was trying to run a retail store, and if somebody come through that front door I didn't know, I wanted to go through the floor. I wanted to run. I didn't want to even talk to them. And thank God that there is some members of Alcoholics Anonymous that will make an unsolicited 12-step call. Because one was made on me, and that's why I still work with the wet drunk, and I still make unsolicited calls. Not many of them come in, but they can get the message if they want it. But this man come in, and I had never seen an alcoholic in a suit of clothes. Now, down there in Phoenix, I saw this people of the Skid Row where they all died, And I thought that was alcoholics. I didn't know alcoholics slept between clean sheets at night. I didn't know alcoholics run businesses. I didn't know that there was women alcoholics. See, all I had been associated with was that 3% that go to Skid Row. I had not been associated with the other 97% that can get off of that elevator any place they want to. So this man walked in the store, and he was walking straight. He's about 6'4", and he heard him ask for me. Scared me to death. Now, I don't want to talk to him because he looks like some kind of a district attorney to me. So I tried to make him leave. I kept putting him off, and he just walked around there and was just so unconcerned and whistled a little bit. Finally, I could see the man wasn't going to leave. So I went over. I said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "Yes, I'd like to see you in the back room." And that's when I almost died. Man, these legs are shaking. And we get back there, and he goes up like this. And, oh, my God, he ain't coming. He pulls out a card. He says, "My name is Don. I'm an alcoholic. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous." And I know exactly what I told him. I said, "Only my wife thinks I drink too much. I can quit any time I want to." Now, if anybody ever makes that statement to you, you're looking straight in the eyes of a full-blown alcoholic. Because a social drinker don't have to say that. And he said, "Well, if you ever want any help, give me a call." And turned around and walked out. He did not argue with me. He said, "If you want any help, just give me a call." And walked straight. And I stood back there. But see, whenever he told me he's an alcoholic and a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, I didn't know about your hugging and your kissing in AA. But that man almost got hugged in my back room whenever I found he wasn't no district attorney. But you know, I'm seeing the white monkeys go into my brain, and now here is an alcoholic, and I can see him walking out that door straight. And every time I get drunk, I'm seeing this. And it's about to drive me crazy. Now, I've been going to church. Let me tell you about the church now. I done quit the Baptist church. I done quit that long ago. I done joined. See, I knew the Presbyterians drank some. Now, I done changed from the Baptist to the Presbyterian. Now, it didn't help my illness any. It got worse. Now, had I known more about religion than I did, I'd have taken some lessons and probably become a Catholic if I could have made it. But I didn't know about that. But now, I'm trying to go to church. I'm getting to the point now that my wife won't go with me, my youngest son won't go with me, because my life's becoming unmanageable. They won't even go to church with me. Now, that's getting bad. And this particular morning in December of 1968, it was cold. I went in and put on the best clothes I had. And I started the church. I didn't have a drink. But on the way, that knot was about to kill me. And I thought, well, if I'll just get me some vodka and have it where I can get to it, that'll help. I stopped and I bought a half pint of vodka. I put it under the seat. And I drove into that churchyard. The church had two services. One service was letting out, and the other service was coming in, 11 o'clock service. I laid down in the floorboard of the car and drank half of that half pint of vodka before I could go in. I went in that church. We was in there probably 45 minutes to an hour. And I knew that everybody in there knew what I'd done. And I didn't have a dry thread left on my shirt. When I walked out of that door, I knew I was going to die drunk. And there wasn't nothing I could do about it. I have never had this much remorse in my life. And as I walked to the car, I thought, how can I take my life and make it respectable? And then I thought about that cliff up there in Lee's Canyon. That I'll get me a tow sack, and I'll fill it with half pints of vodka, and I'll carry it down there, and I'll get under that rock, and I'll drink myself to death. And then I had another thought. In case I can't drink myself to death, I don't want to starve to death. So I got to get me some pork and beans and crackers up there and some Vienna sausage. And that's going to take 2 sacks, and I got to make 2 trips. And you know, I've toyed with that idea until I had my life. I sobered up before I ever figured it out. I never have figured it out yet. But anyway, my life's drunk started on the 11th of January 1969. And I left home that morning, and I balled up my fist as I walked out the door, and I said, today I'm not going to drink. Nobody could have meant that statement any more than I meant it at that particular time. We walked out, got in the car. I reevaluated that statement and pulled into the first liquor store I got to and got me a half pint of vodka. Drank half of it and went on to the store. I drank off and on all day long. That night there was a basketball game at the convention center, and I had tickets. My wife wouldn't go with me. My son wouldn't go with me, and I threw him to hell with him. And I knew I should go to sleep and sleep it off. The next thing I remember, I'm pulling back onto the interstate overlooking the city of Las Vegas. And I knew I'm drunk, and I knew I should pull over and go to sleep. But that wasn't the way it happened. I got home. We lived on a little incline up to the house. And the next thing I remember, I'm home. And I get out of the car, and I'm trying to walk, and I can't walk. And I thought I'd crawl, and I couldn't even crawl in. And I got back in the car, and I passed out. And sometime during the night, my wife and son got me out of that car and put me in bed. And I woke up on Sunday morning of January the 12th with the clearest thoughts that I'd had for years. It was like I had run into a wall that I couldn't go over, I couldn't go around, and I couldn't go under. And I knew prayer wasn't going to do any good because I'd prayed for a long, long time. But that morning, what had scared me so badly that night was that I knew I had drove the Las Vegas Strip in a blackout. And I knew what they'd do to you if you hit anybody in a lighted crosswalk. And it scared me to death. That morning, my wife had long left that bedroom, and I was sleeping in a bedroom with tinfoil on the windows and the drapes pulled. I did not want to see out, and I didn't want you to see in. And in that lonely bedroom that morning, I dropped down on my knees, said the simplest prayer I'd said for a long time, but the most sincere. God, take the desire of alcohol from me. I cannot do it myself. And in 5 or 10 minutes, I got up and I went outside to look and see if I'd put any more dents on the car, and I could not see them. Picked up a newspaper, and there was a half pint of vodka out there in a little brown bag with the top twisted that had fell out of my pocket the night before. I don't know where I bought it, but I've never had to drink it. And I walked back through to the door, and it was like 200 pounds dropped off of my shoulders. I set the newspaper down and went back to that lonely bedroom and fell in bed and slept for about 3.5 hours of the soundest, most relaxing rest and sleep I had had for several years. Got up that day and watched the 3rd Super Bowl and thought it was the first. The next day, I went to work, and I didn't sweat for a drink. And that night, when Norma was getting ready to go to Al-Anon. I told her, I said, I believe if you'll wait a minute, I'll go with you. Nobody knew I was going to a meeting that night. I went in and washed my face, and I went to AA. We got down to the clubhouse, and she went into the Al-Anon meeting, and I went into the AA meeting, and it was a stag meeting. And there's about 35 people in there, and they asked for newcomers, and everybody said their name, and they were an alcoholic. I just got up and said, my name's Joe. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, as these people are called up to the podium and they're talking and they don't have no notes, they're just talking from the heart. And I was looking at one guy and I said, if I was as big as you and as strong as you are, I wouldn't be sitting in this room. His name was Jack. Jack got up and said the last 5 years he drank, he couldn't lick his lips. Every fight he got into, he lost. But about halfway through the meeting, I'm done start to get mad now. My wife started out to one meeting a week. Now she's been going 6 nights a week. And I don't know why she wasn't going the 7th night. I thought to myself, she's been out with every man that's talked tonight. She's told them about me. She's told them what to say when I get here. And I'm not coming back. So the meeting was over, and on the way home, she said, what did you think? I said, I'm not going back. It's not for me. But let me tell you what brought me back the next night. And I think the second meeting is awfully important. To get me back to my second meeting the next night was because of your eyes and your laughter. The laughter I hadn't had for a long time, but you laughed all the way down, and it sounded good. And I didn't know at that time that your eyes are the mirrors to your soul. But those two things brought me back. And I identified with the women. And I said, my God, she couldn't have been out with all of them. And I went back the third night. The third night, I didn't only admit I was an alcoholic, I accepted it. And I bought me the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I went home that night, and I wasn't sleeping too good, and I started to read. And I had no idea that I could not obtain what I was reading. The first time I read the first 164 pages of the big book, I could only remember one paragraph. It's in chapter 3, about middle ways down the page. It says, if we be alcoholic, we're like a man with no legs. We can't grow new ones. See, my father had been a diabetic for 30 years. He admitted it. He never did accept it. He lost one leg and then 2 legs. See what he would do. When he felt good, he done what he wanted to do. When he felt bad, he done what the doctors told him to do. So the result was, sugar diabetes took his life. This paragraph told me that if I be alcoholic, I cannot take one drink and live a normal life. And thank God he let that soak in, and I could remember that, because I have not had to be drunk since that January 12, 1969. I come along and I was doing well. I was happy with my sobriety. I told Norma I wasn't going to these meetings, maybe once a month. The first year I was in Alcoholics Anonymous, I made over 450 meetings. I had to have something to fill that space that I used for drinking, and I was a daily drinker and around-the-clock drinker. And then I'd been sober about 8 months, and we still had this little business, and it had started to grow back and was going. I still had the Western Auto Store. And on October the 5th of 1969, we had some racial riots, and our store was destroyed. I'm going to tell you about what happened to me that afternoon in that store. I can't tell you what. I don't know. I want to explain what happened, and you can tell me, because anybody that's had this experience, you know what I'm talking about. I never have been this scared in my life. With the police standing at the door, on each side of the door, and people getting beat to death and stomped to death out here to the unconsciousness, and they weren't doing anything. I went back to the back room and I come out with my shotgun. I had a 6-shooter back there, and I had number 2 shot in it. And I didn't hear any voices, but there was a thought come to me, go set it down. And whenever that thought come to me, a calmness that I cannot explain come over me. I set it down, I walked up, I knocked the registers open, took out the greenback, left the change in there, and Norma and I went to the car. We had to go through this mob. She had her pistol and I had mine. But it was a calmness. I know that God took over and I didn't ask him to. I know that. We got in the car and we left. Nobody tried to run us, pull us out of the car. Nobody tried to harm us in any way. I just knew when I got 4 blocks away that I'd never go in business in that location again. We went home and we saw a television camera moving in as we moved out. And we went home and we watched our business carried away on live TV. There's riding the bicycles. There's rolling the automobile tires. They were taking our business away from us. But I didn't have to get drunk. I had found something that was worth a lot more than material things. Because material things won't make you happy. I had found this out. And that night I went to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I can hardly tell this story today without breaking up. And just bear with me if I do. But that night I went to that same meeting with those 35 to 40 men. And of course they were so happy. Even a black motorcycle gang come over to rescue Norma and I, but we'd already got out ahead of this. And here was George, and here was Don, and here was these people. They come up and they put their arms around me and they said, if you don't drink, you'll always have food. If you don't drink, you'll have shelter. And they gave me strength that night. And I don't know whether I'm bankrupt or whether I'm not. I don't know. But with these men, it was the first time I guess I'd ever felt the love of another person. And they were giving me strength. And this is what happened. That during that time, it took quite a long time to get a settlement. But you never have enough. And my attorney told me that I'd have to take bankruptcy. My CPA told me I'd have to take bankruptcy. My banker that I owed $20,000 told me I'd have to take bankruptcy. And I told him I wasn't born or raised to take bankruptcy. And they said, well, there's no other way out. My sponsor in Alcoholics Anonymous is the poorest businessman that ever walked on the face of this earth. He'd been in Alcoholics Anonymous 8.5 years. He was a busboy at the El Cortez Hotel. George says, if you want to take the easy, softer way out, go ahead and take bankruptcy. If you don't want to, you use the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, George, what you talking about? Don't know what the principles are. He said, the first principle you use is the principle of honesty. He said, how many people you owe? I said, I don't know. He said, go find out. He said, find out. He said, how much do you owe? I said, I don't know. He said, well, find out. And we made up a list, and there was 45 people. He said, you go to all these people, and you look them in the eyes, and you tell them the truth. You tell them you'll pay them, but you can't pay them now. But you don't promise them nothing that you can't do. And he said, as you get some money, he said, you don't go pay one of them off and leave this one over here. He said, you might just pay them a dime. But he said, you're making an effort. See, up to that point, I thought if you owed somebody something, you had to go shell it all out at one time and be a big shot. I didn't know you could go give it a nickel and a dime at the time. Well, I went to these 44 people. If I couldn't go to them, I wrote them. And 44 out of the 45 went along with me. The one that I couldn't make any contact with, I hope is a member of this fellowship. Because he was doing the same thing that I was doing. He wouldn't answer his phone. He wouldn't answer his door. And he wouldn't open his mail. Or he wouldn't answer his mail. So I had to go pay him off. George also set up a deal that I was going to pay this all back in 7 years. I had paid the bank for about 2 years of this, and one day I walked in there, and the loan officer said, "How much do you still owe?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Why don't you find out income?" I said, "Wouldn't you like to make just one payment instead of all these payments?" Now, this is the one that told me I had to take bankruptcy. I said, "Yes, I would." He said, "Come back, and we'll loan you the money to pay everybody else off." And they did. And George had set this up for me to pay it off in 7 years. And I made my last payment in 6 years and 11 months to pay all of that off. Now here is a dumb businessman that has given me this kind of advice, but he's a member of Alcoholics Anonymous in good standing. And about 3 years ago or 4, we was out in Las Vegas to a Sun and the Fun roundup, and all of us, there's a whole table of 10 of us that come in 1969, and George was sitting over here, and I said, "George, as dumb as you are," I said, "how could you give me this kind of advice?" George said, "Somebody told me." And that's the way I feel that this program works. Somebody told me. And they've told me all along to bring me along in this program and help tear away those leaves or those layers away from this core that has damn near choked me to death. Now, I went that year at Christmas time. I took a little package down to the post office the day before Christmas. Now, there's 3 things I didn't like then, and there's 3 things I don't like today. I don't like to go to the post office and have to stand in line when I can see people not working. They're standing back here talking. Okay, if you're going to take a break, get the hell out of the way. Don't let me see you. I don't like that. I don't like to go into a bank and have all these out to lunches. They put in more and more cages, but you go in there at 10 o'clock in the morning and half of them are out to lunch already. And I don't like to go in a grocery store and see them $15,000 and $20,000 check stands not being used when they got people running around over here and they got lines. I don't like that. And that day I went to the post office and I had to stand in line to mail a package to North Carolina. And I got mad. I went on to the bank to cash a check and I had to stand in line because they didn't have all of those gates open. And then I went to the grocery store, and at that time I'd been in the grocery business 25 years. And I know the day before Christmas is the busiest day you have. I know this. They didn't have all of the registers open, and I had to stand in line. And by the time I got home, I was a wreck. I was a wreck. I was sick. I had to go to bed. And as I lay in there in that bed and I got to thinking, hell, that package is not going to get to North Carolina tomorrow. I should have mailed it 2 weeks ago. You knew that you didn't have any money. Why didn't you go to the bank before today? And you stupid about going to the supermarket the day before Christmas. The point I'm trying to make is I had handled the elephant and losing my business and losing every material thing I had, but I couldn't handle the mosquitoes. And it was the mosquitoes that's eaten me up since I've been in this program. Elephants don't bite, mosquitoes do. And that's what you have to watch about this program. It's what you have to watch about life. And I also watch that full moon, too. I'll tell you what, you come through a cycle or 2 of that, you can get some faith. You know, in 1972, my wife and I had already made reservations way in advance to go to the Palm Springs Convention. And her mother got very ill in Texarkana. I'm telling you something now that I've never told, to my knowledge, to an AA group. Because this being a retreat, I didn't want to run people off that might be new in the program and think I'm up here making up a story. But she was back in Texarkana, and she was with her mother. And her mother kept having these small strokes, and then she fell and broke her hip. And what we'd been planning on was to bring her mother back to Las Vegas. And we had already fixed up a room for her, and we was ready to move her when she was able to move. But the doctors had told my wife that she should get a hold of her brothers, that she didn't think her mother was going to last much longer. Her older brother had not had any contact with the family for a long time. And she had told me that they'd even looked through telephone bills, trying to find where maybe her mother had called her older brother, or whether maybe he had called, or maybe that there'd been a collect call, and they could find no trace of where he was. And as I say, we'd had the deal, and I was working on commission as a salesman, and I was trying to do 5 days' worth of work in 4, and I was working day and night that deal so I could go to Palm Springs. And that's whenever I heard the senator talk. Dave talked over there, and Willard was there, and all these people. A great conference. So I knew it was going to be a good conference, because I'd done wore one of Dave's tapes out, playing it to these crazy people that I'd bring in the house trying to get them sober. And if they would listen to his tape twice and they didn't get sober, I took them to a crazy house. Because anybody could listen to his tape and still drink, they had to be crazy. But anyway, I wanted to hear Dave. And, and that night, I didn't go to AA. It was on Thursday night. I went to Satoma. I had rejoined the Satoma group after I got sober. And the club, TIE club, is on my way home. And I was going straight home and write my orders. And I caught myself sitting right in front of that TIE club. And I said, as long as I'm here, I'll go in, I'll have a cup of coffee, and then I'll go on home and write my orders. And I walked in the back door of the TIE club, and Rusty had been coming to those meetings every night, and he'd been there for about 9 months. And I'd been talking about the 4th and the 5th step, how it made you feel when you done it inside, like taking a bath on the inside. And Rusty said, oh, Joe, I didn't think you was going to be here tonight. He said, I got to take a 5th step with you. I said, oh, Rusty, no, you got to take a 4th step first. He said, I got 18 pages, got to get it off right now. I said, well, if you do, come on. We went back into the central office and locked the door. Rusty hadn't been talking 5 minutes till he mentioned my brother-in-law by name. Hair come up on my arms. I didn't stop him. I let him go. He finished up about 1:30. And I said, when you was talking about that Curry's candy and ice cream store in San Pedro, I said, where is it located? He said, well, it's located on Pacific Boulevard. And he said, it's in the 1000 block. And he said, Lee Flowers was there 10 months ago. I went home, and that morning before I left to go to Palm Springs, I got a number for the Curry's ice cream and candy store. And Norma's brother answered the phone. I told him about his mother. He said, I can't leave today, but as quick as I can get somebody in here, I'll leave. I went on to convention. I come back. I left Monday, flew to Texarkana. Her brother Lee had got there about an hour before I did on Monday afternoon, late. He was in the room with his mother when she passed away at 5 o'clock on Wednesday morning. Now, at that time, I thought that this was just a coincidence. I had not become aware of what can happen to us. There's 2 things, in my opinion, that can make up AA: acceptance and awareness. And that weekend, we had not discussed anything about moving to Texarkana. My wife had already taken me to the airport on Friday night after we had buried her mother on Friday. And they told me that they only had me through to Dallas, but they had me on standby. I said, no, I'll stay here and put me through tomorrow. We come back and we're sitting out in the yard and we was talking with her brother, and he said, what are you going to do with this house? Well, Norma said, we'll just let the lady that's been here for 7 years go ahead and stay here and handle it. He said, suppose she don't want to. And just like that, I realized I had a problem. I went in to the back bedroom and got on my knees. And I asked God for some guidance. I walked out there and sat down, and I wasn't out there 15 minutes till I started having thoughts. You can sell anything you've got in Las Vegas and get your money out of it. You can't give this stuff away back here. You've got some confidence in yourself. Why don't you move back? We was coming back when I retired. I looked over and I said, Norma, do you want to move back to Texarkana? She said, I sure would. I said, we're moving back. Got up and went and called the airport, told them to cancel my reservation, stayed with her. We got the death certificate. We got everything that we were supposed to have done with her mother. We drove back to Las Vegas. I resigned my job. We started having garage sales, and 5 weeks later we was on our way back to Texarkana to live. Without a job, without anything. Come back to Texarkana. We got in at 11:30. Her younger brother that had left before we did had come in at 1:30. He had just lost his third family. He was offshore oil driller. Dick started going to AA with me. He never did say he was an alcoholic, but he went with me from August till November. And the night before he had his stroke and died, he told me, we was playing cards, and he said, the higher power that I found going to AA with you is riding on my shoulder tonight. And that was the last statement that he ever made. He had a stroke the next morning, and 9 days later, he died. I had put my name on the 12-step list when I first moved there, and I'd never had a call. He wasn't buried 24 hours till I got my call. Now, I don't tell these things, and it's the first time I've ever told these, but they are something that's so spiritual that I know now that this was God. I know this was God guiding me. And just think, if I'd have had to have been good to have got this, I never would have had it. I never would have had it. Because I had a little trouble with my work habits. And it's like the alcoholic that was out one morning, and he got stopped by the police about 11 o'clock, and they said, he said, what do you do? He said, I work. He said, where do you work? He said, I work at the domino factory. He said, what do you do? He said, I put dots on dominoes. He said, how come you're not working today? He said, hell, they're running double blanks. So that's about the way I was. An alcoholic can come up and they can think faster than anybody I know. It's just been a pleasure to be here, and I'm sorry I took up so much time, but there's two stories that I had not told before, and I don't know, I had just an urge in talking with Dave this afternoon. Thank you, and God bless you.
Joe, we have a little gift from the Blackstone Retreat to token our appreciation of you sharing with us.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Let's end this meeting by praying together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you again, buddy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You done good.